And I'm delighted to introduce Matthew Andrews. Matthew is the owner and director of Yoga Center Amherst, which is located right behind our beloved UU Meeting House. I met Matthew last year as a student in his yoga teacher training program, in which he taught yoga philosophy. Participating in the program deepened my love for yoga and yoga spirituality. Matthew's been studying meditation, postural yoga, and yoga philosophy since his first trip to India 20 years ago. He organizes yoga retreats to India, and his own spiritual journey has been guided by several teachers, most significantly Guruji Ma, who lives at the Village of Light Ashram in Leverett, Massachusetts. This year, Matthew released his first album of spiritual music called Let It Open, and he will share his cover song following the offering. He lives with his wife and their 2 children in Amherst. So a big welcome to you, Matthew. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you so much, Jess, and thanks for inviting me. And thank you to all of you for welcoming me into your sacred Sunday morning gathering time. It's really, I'm deeply honored. And I'm excited to share with you some of the beauty and wisdom and magic and wonder of the yoga tradition. I think it's becoming more commonly understood these days that yoga is not just stretchy aerobics, that yoga has a deeper, it's part of a deeper wisdom tradition. And the essence of that tradition starts with sacred texts that go back thousands of years called the Vedas. And I'm not going to talk much about the Vedas today, but they're the foundation, they're the core basis out of which the yoga tradition emerged. And one of the key things that the Vedas describe or tell us is that we're living in a responsive universe. So mostly, especially the root Veda, the Rig Veda, is hymns of praise and interactive hymns of praise with the universe, with the cosmos. So after the time of the Vedas, which, like I said, you know, scholars sometimes try to pinpoint the date, and there's lots of argument about when this actually happened, when the Vedas were actually received, written down, all that stuff. I tend to keep myself out of those scholarly arguments because it doesn't seem that anybody's come to a clear conclusion. And the tradition itself says that the Vedas were never, they're timeless. They exist outside of the realm of time and space, and that they were received at least 10,000 years ago or more. That aside, basically what happened is probably somewhere around 3,000 years ago, maybe a little bit more, 3,500 years ago. There was a consolidation of the Vedic tradition into what we would call a religion. So a priestly caste formed, and they started saying, these are the rules, and this is how things are done. And they kind of created an external formulation of the Vedas, which have both an inner, and this is true throughout the yoga tradition. Oftentimes, there's an external story, something that relates to the natural world or to human interactions. And then there's the internal microcosmic subjective meaning, the archetypes that are embedded within the stories. And so the priests basically extracted the subjective internal and said, we're here, we know everything, you need to pay us. You know, in the West, we're familiar with this tradition. You know, we're the intermediaries. You need to go through us if you want to talk to the cosmos. This was happening around the time that cities were sprouting up in the Indus Valley, in what's now northwest India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, that area. There was this, you know, new cities and agriculture, and suddenly there was the haves and the have-nots. And in the midst of this kind of burgeoning, confusing, complicated, exciting time, there was a movement of people who left the cities, who went out into the fields and forests, left behind their family connections, their social obligations, and went and lived off of the land and in, I mean, there's snakes and mountain lions and rain, hurricanes, cyclones, etc. They went and they left the comforts of ordinary life and went on a quest to understand what is going on here. What is this life? And they rejected the Brahmanical, what the caste of priests were called Brahmins. So it's kind of the Brahminical structure that had said, we know what's real and we're going to tell you what's real. And so they were seeking truth. They were seeking experience, embodied experience, not just some abstract concepts. And this movement was called the Sramanas. They called themselves the Sramanas. And it was a pretty big, wide-ranging movement. Sramana essentially means struggle, strive. So they were working, efforting, trying to discover the nature of themselves. And they did, there was a whole range of different groups, traditions, lineages of Sramanas. And actually they formed collectives which were called ashrams. And so that's where we get the word ashram from. And these Sramanas did everything from decide that they're going to stand up for the rest of their lives, or for 12 years, or stand on one leg, or keep an arm raised over their heads. And you can still, if you go to India in certain places, especially if you go to a spiritual gathering like the Kumbh Mela, you'll see people whose arm is just up and it's kind of grown into place like that. So these are things that are still happening today, or people who have made a little swing so they never have to sit down or lie down, and they just kind of use that, hang it from a tree and stand there. They did all kinds of physical, psycho-spiritual experiments using their own inner bodies, and then they shared with each other. And so, the commitment to what is real, what is truth, how do I understand my place in the cosmos, was very strong and very powerful. And when they formed collectives, they reinforced, the energy of a team. We kind of are familiar with what a team can do, what a team can support each other to do. So they kind of thrived off of each other's discoveries. And maybe 1,000, 1,000 years in the context of 3,000 isn't that much, but you think of 1,000 years, maybe it was 500, definitely several hundred years of the Sramanas exploring, learning from each other, formulating their experiences. We have a text that is written called the Yoga Sutra, and it's attributed to a person named Patanjali. I'm not going to get into all the fascinating nuances of who Patanjali was and the fact that he probably wasn't one person, and what the Yoga Sutra was. But essentially, it's a compilation. It's like, these are a lot of the things that people have discovered over the past several hundred to 1,000 years of deep introspective truth-seeking. And the first verse, well, the second verse of the Yoga Sutra is Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is when the mind stops spinning. So it gives right away a definition of what is yoga. It doesn't say yoga is if you can put your foot behind your head, or yoga is if you can stand on one hand in the middle of the room. It says yoga is when the mind stops spinning. And maybe we could even say that putting your foot behind your head is easier if any of you have ever tried to stop your mind from spinning. You think of the word vritti, that's used for the whirling, the spinning of the mind. It's like an eddy. You think of a river, your consciousness is like a river, and it stops every time there's a rock, every time there's a stick, every time there's a little bit of a cavity, there's this whirl, this spin that happens. It's a natural thing. And it's the same in our minds. There's this kind of spinning around a certain thought, and then it kind of passes through. So there's a sense of yoga as this focusing on what's going on in my consciousness. Yoga is the stilling, the stopping, the cessation of the spinning of thought in the mind. Tada drashtau svarupe vastanam, so that the seer, so that the one who sees, the witness, can rest in its own nature. So yoga isn't a striving to get better at something. It's not a competitive enterprise. It's not, let's find and perfect my ego and my sense of self. It's so that the seer, the one who sees, can rest in its own natural state. So that's the summation, and the Yoga Sutras goes on for almost 200 different sutras like that. Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha has one sutra, so there's almost 200 sutras. But the beginning of it really sets the framework. Yoga is the cessation of the spinning of the mind so that the seer can rest in its own natural state. There's a real relevance, I find, to this simple articulation in our modern world. We're facing a situation where what has been relied upon for a definition of reality, the structures of our society that have told us what's real and what's not, are breaking down. As human consciousness has developed, so society and social mores and social morals have kind of created a container for us to understand what's real and what's not. And we've reached a point where there's a real kind of pulling apart and polarization of society, so that we have, in so many circumstances, two separate definitions of reality. And the sources of truth that we have looked to as a collective over time, we're starting to understand that they're flawed, that they have prioritized white perspective over other perspectives, that they have prioritized people, the structures of our society, the laws of our society have prioritized certain groups of people over other groups of people. And so it's not just that we see misinformation and fake news and all that stuff. That's part of it. But it's also the actual structures that we've leaned on. We see, wow, they're kind of corrupted and kind of not so strong, not as integrated as we had come to believe. So what do we do in a situation like that when the structures of our society that we've relied on to define reality for us are no longer perceived as reliable? Where do we find truth? Even when we look to science, as many of us do, to define the nature of reality, we begin to see that science itself has become a religion of fundamentalist materialism, where it says, if you can't measure it with your eyes and your ears, if you can't measure it materially, it doesn't exist. And so science can't address something like the existence of consciousness itself, or what happened before the Big Bang, or why are we here? The things that keep us up at night. What is love? We try to get at it, but it's kind of like trying to write with gloves on. The mechanisms that we have at our disposal aren't quite up to the task. And so we're faced with this conundrum. And I loved the quote that Mary read about new light drawing us forward, because that's another quality of the yoga tradition, the understanding that we are collectively and individually in an iterative, progressive, evolutionary process, that consciousness is developing and evolving. And that's not just like the evolution of consciousness happened up till today and now we're all done. It's time to, time to go home, shake hands, pat ourselves on the back. No, it's still happening. And how does it happen? Well, you may have heard of the Japanese term, the Zen Japanese term, koan. A koan is a phrase like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? That kind of, you get stuck. The mind is like, well, I don't know what to do with that. What? And the intention of it is that it pulls us out of our ordinary frame of thinking into a new frame of thinking. So I like to think of the climate crisis, or the Black Lives Matter movement, or the reality of nuclear proliferation, the breakdown of the kind of the social fabric, as a koan, because it's forcing us to search inside of ourselves for some other way of defining what is reality and what is truth. It's forcing us to examine our subjective experience and ask these questions. What is real? What is true? What is integrity? When am I sincere? And anything that pulls us into that questioning is powerfully transformative. Society, one of the ways that it's used to keep things together is moral obligation. And that's been important to kind of override the natural impulses of the ego towards destruction and greed. But at a certain point, when we're facing these massive issues, global issues, moral obligation, it becomes an abstraction. You know, if my daughter falls down, I run to her. I can't help it. It's not something I think about, well, hold on, should I help her? Because like, she didn't clean up her room. You know, she falls down the stairs. I'm not evaluating anything, I'm there. When someone else's daughter on the other side of the world is starving, when someone else's daughter is suffering as a result of you know, a global systemic structural inequality system, it's hard for me to feel or understand what I should do about that. If I see someone on the street who's suffering, it's hard for me to navigate. How do I maintain my own integrity and understand myself, and also bring this person into myself? So this sense of moral obligation that kind of governs our lives and allows us to create a just society, at a certain point, it has limitations. And if we go into our own subjective experience, if we examine what is this witness, what is this seer that is there in its own form after the whirling of the thought waves, what we come to see is that there's an interconnectivity between me and the cosmos. And the quantum physics has discovered this. The unified field theory basically says there is no separation between individuated objects and people. We're all just dependently co-arising out of this collective field. We are all one. We're a human family, and we're part of an intricate, interwoven part of this incredible cosmos. That sense, that lived experiential sense of we are a human family, it creates a whole different kind of motivation to serve, to be present to love, to support each other, than some kind of moral obligation. It creates the same kind of unthinking, direct need to help my daughter when she falls down the stairs. It just bypasses the whole thought process, the whole analytical process. And so when we feel and expand our sense of self so that it takes into account both our unique, radiant individuality and our interbeing with the collective, the Bhagavad Gita, which is another subsequent text of the yoga tradition. So the Yoga Sutras came about somewhere around 2,000 years ago. Bhagavad Gita probably came about a little bit after that. It's also a synthesis of different streams of wisdom. It's one of the things it says is that you're not the doer. I'm not the doer. As soon as I think of myself as the doer, I'm deluded by egoism, is what the text says. Deluded by egoism. The doer, the individuated self that thinks this is me and this is all there is an illusion. It's a trick of perception. It's something that was created like a koan to focus our understanding and awareness in a certain space, in a certain time frame. But the yoga tradition generally teaches that this whole situation, the duality that we experience, the individuation that we experience, the separateness from ourselves, the objectification of the world around us, this is all a result of an illusion, a trick of perception. And that the reality, the underlying reality, is one of unity. And when and this is where the Yoga Sutras comes in, is it's a path towards experiencing that unity, towards what's called samadhi. Samadhi is like universal vision, seeing, experiencing the oneness of all, without the whirls of our thoughts coming in and distorting our perception. And if you've ever watched your thoughts for long enough, you may have noticed that they're not all yours. They don't just, sometimes it's my wife's voice in there. Sometimes it's my mom's voice in there. Sometimes it's my son's voice in there. Sometimes it's something I saw on the news that just kind of penetrated in. These voices are speaking inside my head with the authority of myself. They kind of disguise themselves as like, this is me. But if I sit there and look at them long enough, and I maybe give a little sniff, that doesn't smell like me. Who is that? And I can kind of determine maybe where it came from. We are populated, our inner worlds are populated with the voices of others. And so in order to move in this direction of having a unified experience of our collective wholeness that can motivate us to move from a place that's deeper than moral obligation, the abstraction of moral obligation. In order to get there, I need to be able to sort out those voices. I need to be able to sort out, who am I in the midst of all of this? Where do I stand in the midst of all of this? And to allow the rest of those voices to kind of create some space, at least at first, so that the rest of those voices I perceive as coming in from the outside. And then I have to have the courage to dance to the beat of my own drum, which is not necessarily a simple thing. To become aware of all the places where my individual truth does not necessarily resonate with the voices around me, and stand in that truth. That doesn't mean, we have in this country this tension between freedom, individual freedom, and justice and equity, right? This kind of long time tension from the beginning of the founding of this country. That's inside of each one of us as well. It's not, just some abstract external thing. Inside of me is my own soul and its quest to say, I'm here. I am here. This is the unique quality of my being and the unity that I am with all beings. The deepening, the processes of yoga, the processes of meditation, processes of withdrawing the senses, of using the breath as a way of centering in the body. All these processes, even the processes of postural yoga, which has kind of exploded on the world stage, even the process of postural yoga exist in service of this quest to know ourselves as both completely unique, completely here to express our unique individuality, and absolutely inextricably interwoven with the fabric of this incredible, majestic cosmos. So that's my quick, simple summation of the yogic path that has been poured down through the centuries and has proliferated all over the world in recent years. And I again thank you all so much for having me, and am grateful for the opportunity to share this wisdom that's so dear to me. Thank you. And so I'll close with a prayer from the yoga tradition, which means, well, the prayer is Om Namo Bhagavate, Om Namo Namaha. I bow to the Supreme Being who lives within all. Blessings to all of you. Thank you.